Creed 3 is coming up pretty soon, and I realized that I should probably talk about the rest of the films in the franchise. So why not continue with number 4. Written and directed by Sylvester Stallone, starring almost everybody from the previous films, and Dolph Lundgren as Ivan Drago, which because of that most people would call this movie as the one where he fights the Russian. The film was released in 1985 during one of the final heights of the Cold War, and since this was released during the height of the Cold War, the film's content features a lot of pro-America, anti-Soviet Union type of scenes. The film got a somewhat mixed to negative response as a result. Not just for those scenes, but other things too, which we'll talk about. But this film actually has a decent amount of emotion, including what they do with Apollo Creed here, which has significant dire consequences for later films like Creed 1 and 2. So after the fight with Clubber Lang, Rocky is still on top as the heavyweight champion, and he's going to be challenged to a fight by Ivan Drago from Russia, while his wife and promoter are speaking on his behalf. And Apollo one day catches wind of this, and he decides to put on the challenge to Ivan Drago instead. It plays into the whole, it's us against them, the US versus Soviet Union mentality. I can watch it with some historical context and give it a pass, but sometimes it does come off as obnoxious. But on the other side of that though, Apollo doesn't really want to leave his fighter lifestyle behind. He hasn't been in the ring in 5 years since he lost to Rocky. He's living very comfortably in his home. He doesn't really have anything left to prove. So I can sort of see why he would take on that challenge, but I think there should have been more emphasis on why it exactly led to him making that choice. And even Rocky is starting to consider retirement now, even though he's still on top. Well, Apollo, I hate to tell you, but that ain't us up there no more, man. Sometimes we gotta change. I don't remember exactly everything he said, but that's basically the gist of what he was saying. I apologize for the way I sound. I have huge hay fever at the moment. I've had a very warm winter, unusually this year, which means that certain things are going to start to blossom and my senses are going to get thrown off. So we'll try to power through this as best as I can. But I guess I have to acknowledge some of the dumb parts of this movie because there are some really stupid ones. Things that are just completely unnecessary. Like the robot that Paulie uses as his girlfriend. I'm not trying to dismiss Sylvester Stallone. I love the guy. I don't know who came up with that, but I swear to God, I hope it was not him. Apparently there's a director's cut for this movie that came out about 2 years ago, and he removed that aspect from the film completely. Thank God for that. Gratefully it's not in there for very long, but does not need to be in there. And if this movie cannot help itself with its pro-America imagery, Ivan Drago coming into the ring from below the stage, seeing a huge theatrical experience with James Brown singing Living in America in the middle of a Las Vegas hotel with all these flamboyant outfits that people are wearing. We can all assume what Drago is saying in his head. What in the world is all this? As far as Ivan Drago, he's very famous in Rocky lore. He doesn't really say much in this one. He just kind of walks around, looks intimidating, very stoic, but whenever he speaks, it's very poignant. If he dies, he dies. I fight to defeat the champion. But then the fight takes a really scary and dramatic turn. When Apollo, as usual, doesn't really take the fight that seriously. Drago's just standing there, waiting for Apollo to do something stupid, and then he unloads on the guy, nearly killing him in the first round. If I were him, I'd probably say it exactly like that. And then eventually in the second round, Drago strikes a killing blow to Apollo Creed, dying in Rocky's arms. And in the first among many, this film has quite a bit of stare-down imagery between Stallone and Dolph Lundgren. And even if the character isn't exactly that interesting on the page, Dolph Lundgren is actually a solid choice. They give him a lot more to do in the second Creed film many years later, but he did fairly well for what this movie needed. So Drago is painted as a killer by the American press. Rocky challenges him to a boxing match in Russia on Christmas Eve, which is decided by the fight promoters in the Soviet Union. And during this press conference is a really kind of on-the-nose obnoxious scene about how Drago's wife calls out the press on how they're painted as the bad guys and that the Americans are painted as the good guys. Her monologue isn't entirely wrong, but still, I don't really think it was necessary. Plus, the way she and the manager are portrayed in this movie, one note and evil. Don't even show a shred of remorse over what happened to Apollo. None. And even when Apollo falls to the ground in the second round, there's a slow-mo effect where we see Drago's wife smiling in glee. Was that over the fact that he won, or that he just practically killed this guy? Hopefully it's not the latter. And for those who don't know, this actress, Brigitte Nielsen? I don't know. Apparently she was married to Sylvester Stallone for a while. And even in the director's cut, her role is significantly reduced. The power that your ex has over you. I do like how this movie handles Adrian. When she finds out what's going on, she pleads with him in horror, saying, "You can't win. He's not like any other fighter that you fought. Rocky doesn't really seem to care, even though he does acknowledge that he possibly could die in the ring this time. And when he drives away, we get a montage of all the big moments that happened in the previous 3 films, including this one, which I think in a way is kind of effective because at this point in the series, if you don't know what happens after this, we don't really know for sure if Rocky's going to survive this fight. So I think it's perfectly reasonable that we would see some kind of a life flash before your eyes type of moment for him, because for all we know, and for all he knows at this point in the series, he might not actually come back to his wife and kid ever again. But eventually when he does arrive in Russia and he goes through some of the training and under the guidance of Duke, Apollo's former trainer, which I really like that they had him be Rocky's trainer up until the 6th film when he had his final fight against Mason Dixon. Adrian eventually does show up to where Rocky's staying in Russia, and instead of a really big speech that she gives, like we saw in the 3rd film, which in that film was absolutely necessary, all she says is, "I'm with you no matter what." We don't really need to go through the same old hurdles like we had before, and it's obviously another trope that we've come to expect from the Rocky series at this point. There's some tension between the two, Rocky's experiencing some difficulty, but then his wife eventually comes back to support him. And without her, he won't fight nearly as good. But with Duke being Rocky's trainer now, I think it goes to show that he saw Rocky's potential all the way back in the 1st film when he saw him on TV fighting those bags of meat. He saw what Rocky was capable of, and he had a respect for him ever since. And the motivational pep talks that he gives to Rocky during the fight, if you were to ever go to an Eagles home game in Philly, the motivational videos they play right before the kickoff starts, this line here,
all your strength, all your power, all your love, everything you've got.
They play this part at every single home game, including the one that I went to a few years ago, bringing us into the training montage where instead of Gonna Fly Now, it's Hearts on Fire. I do love the original Gonna Fly Now theme. This one I think in its own way is superior. Considering the context, he's in a foreign country far away from home, using simple stuff in order to build his raw brute strength. Whereas Drago is using certain types of technology and also steroids to power him up. Hence why he has such freakishly incredible strength. And then we have Rocky running up the mountain, throwing his arms up in the air, screaming Drago's name, further adding to the iconography. I think even Tim Tebow said once on a late night talk show that this movie inspired him to do something like this during one of his training days. With this sequence though, this is I think a symptom of this movie feeling like at times a big giant 1980s music video. With the previous montage where Rocky's thinking back to certain moments in his life, along with this one, this feels like in many ways what you'd see in a music video on MTV in the 1980s. It's entertaining in its own right, but it doesn't always work for me. I don't know how everybody else feels, but when it comes to on my end, it's a little overdone. But we finally get to the big fight, which this is probably the first time I ever saw Rocky IV. It was playing on AMC one day, and it showed the entrance of Ivan Drago coming through the light when the lights are all darkened and he looks really evil and scary. And that eerie music is playing with that snake sound. I think I was like 14 or 15 years old. I was legitimately freaked out by that. And if you couldn't get any more obvious with the political commentary, you have an actor playing Gorbachev. He's not mentioned by name, but it's pretty obvious if you are familiar, at least in some way, with the history of the Cold War. And as Rocky enters the arena, he's booed considerably by the crowd. Probably the most hostile crowd he's ever run into. And then when Drago comes in, everybody's over the moon about him. Just a mirror image of what we saw with Drago and Apollo in the United States, although not as theatrical as the other one. So then the fight begins and Rocky is taking all these heavy punches to the face and to the body, but mostly to the face. Similar to Marv getting hit by the bricks in Home Alone 2. 3 punches that heavy, he should be brain dead by then. His brain matter should be scattered all over the floor of that boxing ring. And the sound effects are overly loud, like they were in some of the previous films, which should further indicate that Rocky should not be standing alive after he takes those punches. But I think the fight in its own way is very well made, so I kinda don't really care. Plus, if he really were to die after those couple hits, we never would have gotten the following sequels, so take what you can get. It's this fight where we actually get to see that Drago isn't exactly invincible as he's made out to be. Rocky lands a really good punch in his face, cutting him. Everybody is in shock. Okay, so maybe he isn't invincible. And it's the first sign of hope that Rocky might actually be able to get out of this alive. Fight goes on for 15 rounds and he continuously gets hammered by this guy, but whenever he gets back up, Drago just has this look of disbelief. Like he can't actually believe that this guy's still standing. And this one always gets me. It's pretty clear that Drago is saying, "Oh, come on, you gotta be kidding me." And eventually Rocky manages to win the crowd over in his favor because somehow they're just wowed by his determination. I prefer the final fight in the second Rocky film with the final round, but this one, I think in its own way, takes the cake with 2 and 3. Not to mention the little bits of wisdom that Paulie manages to throw in along with Duke. He's winning. I see 3 of them out there. Hit the one in the middle. Right! Hit the one in the middle. And just like with certain moments in the second film, when Rocky starts punching away at his opponent, when he starts going to the body on Drago, and Drago's crying out in agony, I start going along with Rocky's punches. But he's able to knock him out, and everybody in the crowd comes into the ring, lifting him up in victory. And Rocky gives this very inspirational speech, which everybody knows: if I can change, you can change, and everybody can change! I guess you could say that Rocky ended the Cold War. Because even Gorbachev stands up and applauds him. Is it really a batting you over the head type of speech? Oh yeah, absolutely. Do I care? None whatsoever. Because Stallone's delivery of those lines, I can't help it. I'm a sucker for that. Rocky IV I definitely wouldn't put in the top tier if I had to rank each of these movies. I think if I had to rank it, it would be somewhere in the middle on the spectrum, and that's mostly because of the emotional undercurrent it has with what they do with Apollo Creed and how it affects later films like Creed 2 and the first Creed. And because of what we see transpire in Creed 1 and 2, I think a lot of people would be able to look at this film in a different light. When it comes to a standalone movie though, my opinion more or less still stands. It's not a terrible movie at all. In its own way, it is very entertaining, but there's just some things that weigh it down that I think are very unnecessary. If the director's cut is any good, which I believe from what I heard apparently it is, if you guys have seen it, is it any good? Just let me know down below. Definitely not my favorite of the Rocky series, but if I'm in the mood for it, I'll give it a watch. So those are my thoughts on Rocky IV. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are in this film. And up next, we'll be talking about Rocky V. That's gonna be an interesting one. Thanks guys once again. See you in the next one, and keep punching.